So how AngularJS application bootstrap? There are two different ways of bootstrapping. One using ng-app directive, which automatically triggers the bootstrapping process, and we can even bootstrap using the manual process. So let's see how automatic bootstrapping of AngularJS applications work in more details. So I have my HTML file, a module, a controller, and some directives. This initial HTML file is called a template. We have an ng-app directive which initializes AngularJS application. I have added a new directive called ng-init here in the body tag. So after the DOM is loaded, our AngularJS script file looks for the ng-app directive. So if we have specified module name, it's going to load that module. Else it's going to start loading the default module. AngularJS always loads the default module. Then AngularJS creates a secret Santa, the injector object. It's a service which is responsible for creating and injecting dependencies. The $injector will then create the $root scope, which is global scope object, and it's also responsible for creating $scope object. So as $root scope is a global scope object, whatever data we define on this scope will be available throughout our application. $injector also creates $compile service object, which is responsible for compiling the static HTML template. Then Angular uses this $compile service to compile the DOM, starting the ng-app root element, processing all the directives and binding in the HTML. So as in our HTML, we have one more directive coming along the way of $compile service, ng-init directive. When ng-init directive's code will get executed, it adds the property named title in the $root scope object. ng-init directive is responsible for creating data values in the current scope. In this case, as the current scope is $root scope, the title property will be created inside the $root scope object, and it will have the value of welcome. As compilation progress, it sees ng-controller directive. So it creates the instance of our controller along with $scope object, which will become the child of our $root scope object. Further compilation finds the binding in the HTML written as double curlies. As explained previously, the expression inside this double curlies will be evaluated in the current scope. In our case, current scope is the $root scope object created by app controller, so it tries to find this title attribute in current scope. But it fails to get there as it's not defined on my $scope object. So it moves up in the hierarchy of scope and it will look for the same attribute on $root scope object. It gets it there and assign the same to the inner HTML property of our h1 tag. Moving on, it gets another data binding expression, which will again get evaluated against the current scope. So it will look for the employee object in the current scope. It gets it there. It renders the DOM using employee object properties. The final output of this complete compilation process will be dynamic DOM created by Angular. They call it the view. Now let's run the HTML and see the output in the browser. So we got the title from $root scope and employee name and designation from the $scope object created by app controller. This is the magic done by Angular after compilation of static template to dynamic view. Now before concluding this lecture, let's see how manual bootstrapping works. So I have HTML for it. You can see I have removed the ng-app directive which automatically bootstraps the application, and I'm checking for DOM ready event on my document. Then calling the angular.bootstrap function, passing document as first argument and our custom module name as second in an array. We must create and pass custom module in manual process. Additionally, we should create our module, controllers, and services before bootstrapping code. What's the use of creating them after bootstrapping?